All right, let's talk about the anatomy of the brain, starting with the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is the big portion of the brain here. We'll highlight it for us. It takes up about 80% of the brain's mass here. So here we have the cerebrum, also referred to as the forebrain. The surface of the cerebrum is highly folded and covered with a superficial layer of gray matter that we'll call the cerebral cortex. Located on the cerebral cortex, you'll find fissures. So just like we see here, the longitudinal fissure. Now, fissures are deep grooves. Those are very deep grooves. You have a longitudinal fissure that divides the left and right halves of the cerebrum. We have sulci as well. Sulci often referred to as a sulcus if it's singular. These are a little bit more shallow depressions that separate the folds or wrinkles. So we can see these little sulci, these shallow depressions. And then the gyri or gyrus. These gyri or gyrus are the folds that increase the surface area. So these folds or the bumps, the hills, as we may think of them as. So if we can identify this whole portion here, this inside of the bumps, inside of the field, this is the gyri. Again, we can identify this one here. And so in between the grooves, we have the gyri. Now, the cerebrum is divided into a pair of large cerebral hemispheres, as we mentioned. That's divided by the longitudinal fissure that divides into the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Each cerebral hemisphere is then further subdivided into lobes. There's 5 different lobes: the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and the insula. The insula is actually located just inside if we moved the lateral sulcus. So the lateral sulcus should identify, make it green, located right here. And just deep to the lateral sulcus, we'll find the insula. Now, let's take a look at those lobes. First, we'll identify the sulci. That's probably the easiest thing to see. We'll identify the central sulcus as well as the lateral sulcus here, these 2 bigger grooves. So the central sulcus. There. The lateral sulcus comes back here. All right. We'll identify, we can get our bearings, right? We can identify our bearings. So we have rostral to the front here, rostral or anterior. And we down below here, we can identify that as inferior or caudal. Inferior or ventral. There we have the rostral and the ventral. So dorsal's on the top and the caudals at the back here. Now, just anterior or rostral to the central sulcus, we'll see the precentral sulcus. The precentral sulcus, and just posterior is the postcentral sulcus. Again, these are anatomical structures that we're identifying here. We'll identify their physiological names too as well. But the precentral sulcus or gyrus, the postcentral gyrus here, located anterior and posterior to the central sulcus. As well, we'll also see the lobes of the brain being divided here. The frontal lobe divided by the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus. The parietal lobe divided by the central sulcus and the perioccipital sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, as well as the lateral sulcus here, the occipital lobe, and then obviously the temporal lobe as well. So we'll put a T there, the O, the parietal lobe, and then the frontal lobe here. Now, as we mentioned, these are kind of the anatomical terms that we refer to these different portions of the brain. Now, if we wanted to refer to these a little bit more about their function or their perhaps even histological or physiological structures, we can refer to them as Brodmann's areas is one of the ways we can do so. Now, a German neurophysiologist by the name Corbian Brodmann performed extensive study of the microscopic anatomy of each of these of the brain here, and so it might be referred to as the cytoarchitecture of the cerebral cortex. And so what he was able to do was divide the cortex into 52 separate regions of the brain based on the histology of the cortex. So his work, referred to as the Brodmann's areas, is actually still used today from early 1900s, and it describes the anatomical distinctions within these cortex as well. So these physiological, the differences in the cells actually give us some differences in the regions of the brain, as we saw. So as we saw here, we can identify the sulcus. In the previous slide here, we can see this. Right here we have the central sulcus. Then we also have the lateral sulcus. I almost called it longitudinal, but the lateral sulcus here. And so as a result, we can identify that the regions, a couple of regions of the brain here, are related to some specific functions. And so remember the let me grab my highlighter here. Remember the precentral gyrus. Now that will be the primary motor cortex. So its function is motor. This is all the movement that's related. So and all movement that is initiated in the brain starts here. The primary motor cortex. The post-central gyri, right, just posterior to the central sulcus, the post-central gyri, will be identified as the primary sensory cortex or the primary somatosensory cortex. Right? We can see this area here. We have the primary somatosensory cortex. All the sensory information will be sent up to the brain from that region. The area number 17, also of interest here, that is the primary visual cortex. So all of the visual information will ultimately be sent to the occipital lobe of the brain here. The primary auditory cortex, located in the temporal region of the brain. And then a couple of other structures we'll talk about as well. We'll talk about Broca's area and Wernicke's area on a separate slide, but related to speech production, and speech interpretation. So the interpretation of speech. So again, these anatomical structures delineated based on their physiological features. So again, we have the let's identify our landmarks first. Our first landmark will be the central sulcus. Our second landmark will be the lateral sulcus or the lateral fissure here. So there's the central sulcus. located just anterior or rostral to the central sulcus. You'll see the primary motor cortex. Posterior to the primary motor cortex, or posterior to the central sulcus, you'll see the primary somatosensory cortex, right? So sensation. In the occipital lobe, we'll see the primary visual cortex. Just posterior to the, or just inferior to the lateral fissure, we'll find the primary auditory cortex for the hearing. The sensory of hearing will be sent there. And now just very close to the primary auditory cortex, right to this area of the sound here, we'll also see that there's two specialized areas often referred to as Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's and Wernicke's. Now, we'll start by identifying that these are related to speech. So either speech production, Broca's area, or speech interpretation, Wernicke's area. So if there was an injury to either one of these areas, it might result in an symptom known as aphasia. Aphasia, inability to speak. And so this inability to speak can often be associated with each of these areas. So you can have Broca's aphasia. Broca's aphasia would be where individuals have difficulty directing motor speech, including thinking about or planning to speak. So what you may hear is a word salad. Individuals have inability to create a coherent phrase or sentence, right? The words that they speak don't relate to the question that was asked, perhaps. So you get like a word salad, perhaps a inability to form coherent speech. You can also have what's known as Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia is something separate here. This is the inability to interpret speech. So you can communicate via speech without too much issues. You can express what you want. The difficulty now becomes in interpreting what others are saying to you with Wernicke's aphasia. So the inability to actually interpret the words that are being used and spoken to you. So that's where the speech issues come in. So there's Wernicke's aphasia as well as Broca's aphasia as well.